So I commend this bill to the House.
I call the honourable member Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As earlier members have indicated, Labor is supporting this local government borrowing bill because it makes absolute sense. It is a mechanism to allow collectively the local government authorities of this nation to use their collective power and might to borrow at more sensible rates, and that collective approach is something that Labor often endorses as a way to go. I think that when this bill was first in gestation, and in fact it predated the Prime Minister's summit, it went back to the Capital Markets Development Task Force, which the last Labor government set up in 2008, and which reported to the new government at the end of 2009, and they proposed the idea of a local government bond bank, and this has evolved from that. And I think at the heart of it in its gestation was a view that it would be most especially Auckland which would be needing a borrowing mechanism such as this, and indeed the bill includes a particular reference to Auckland being able to borrow offshore. But of course, since this bill began its journey through the officials and into the House, we've had the Christchurch earthquakes, and now my city of Christchurch is facing considerable extra rating demand upon it as it works through its process of paying for its share of the costs of recovery. And indeed, in question time in the House today, we heard reference, I think, from Russell Norman about the fact that ratepayers in Christchurch this financial year are seeing an additional 1.75% on top of the earlier expected rate that they will pay this year as Christchurch residents pay their share towards the cost of recovery. And of course, every dollar that the Christchurch City Council is able to borrow a lower rate means another dollar paid off the debt bill that our city must meet as its share of contributions to the cost of the earthquake and the recovery that is needed. And of course, we would much prefer that that was the approach taken, that the council and Christchurch, councils across the country, take the opportunity of what this legislation envisages, use it collectively to borrow, to press down the interest rates and to save their ratepayers, cities and towns and the local authority entities considerable amounts of money. But of course, we always have a concern around what the alternatives might be. And obviously one of the things in our mind at this point is that this is a much better mechanism to allow councils to borrow, to use their collective might to borrow at lower rates. That's certainly a much more preferable option than privatising assets or part privatising assets. And we know that that's certainly on the government's agenda. It's stated as part of the government's agenda in respect of the power assets that the Crown holds, Air New Zealand, Solid Energy. But of course there are other assets in the wider public domain that are also there and are prospects, I think, for such alternatives to borrowing sensibly and repaying debts over a longer time period and using this bill to hold down the interest rates that councils and therefore ratepayers would face. And in my city of Christchurch, we have seen a very solid stream of revenue to the ratepayer base of Christchurch from a number of Crown Council-owned companies, most particularly Orion, which will be known to many members of this House, did a sterling job through the crises of September last year, through the crisis of February this year, and through the June 13th earthquake as well. And Orion has just released its annual report. Members will have been sent a copy fairly recently, and I note in that despite the hellish year that Orion has been through, they still managed to produce an overall profit of $28.4 million and fully imputed dividends back to its shareholders, namely Christchurch City is the most notable shareholder, of $37.5 million. And I, again, with members opposite from Canterbury present, raise the concerns that are emerging in Canterbury about the option that government, and it was referred in question time in the House today, may be considering for Christchurch as an alternative to borrowing as provided for by this bill, sensible borrowing at lower rates, a good mechanism using long-term strategies and using dividend streams from assets such as Orion, that they have the option to, or the government may be putting the option to the Christchurch City Council in most forceful terms of selling off assets like Orion. and I think that members opposite from Canterbury need to give a comment on that issue. And I again raise that question in front of them, as I have every opportunity in the House over the last few months, because it is an important issue for the ratepayers of Christchurch to know whether the government is leaning on the Christchurch City Council, saying to the council, sell off those assets, part sell off those assets, like Orion, like the Port Company, like the Airport Company, like the Enable Broadband Network, like the Red Bus Company, because those assets collectively are worth around $2.2 billion, and if this government has a philosophy that it is appropriate to sell down assets to reduce debt, I ask the question, is the government leaning on the Christchurch City Council to force it effectively to sell down assets instead of taking up much more sensible options as envisaged in this bill to hold on to assets, to use them to leverage and raise capital by way of debt, to use the good effects of this bill to hold down the interest rates that the councils and therefore the ratepayers would pay. That is a much sounder strategy, Mr Speaker, a much sounder strategy than the short-term option of realising assets, selling them off, taking the payments, reducing debt, but carrying the long-term costs. And I note, going back to the Orion example, that the latest dividend of around $37.5 million takes the Orion's payments back to its shareholders, notably Christchurch City Council, over the last 20 years, $1 billion of dividends and other payments returned to the people of Christchurch. You have to ask what sort of madness would inspire any government to consider selling off assets that return that kind of return to the ratepayers of Christchurch. So again, we have members opposite from Canterbury in the House today, and I'd ask them to comment on that issue. The reason that Labor is supportive of this bill is absolutely just plain common sense, to borrow a phrase that a member opposite has been known to use. It is around providing a mechanism for local authorities to collectively raise capital at the best possible rate. And they are facing some extra costs, I do need to note, as a result of some government policy changes. For instance, Christmas last year, in fact December the 23rd, it was a date I'd predicted the Minister of Health would choose, the Minister announced the capping of the funding scheme that Labor had put in place to allow small local authorities, small communities within local authorities to access some assistance to assist them with improving drinking water in small communities across New Zealand. That fund has now been capped at $10 million a year. There's still about $80 million in the fund. It actually was fully funded by the Labor government, $150 million put into the pot. About $80 million was actually still there in the pot, and the Minister has chosen, in a situation where 1 in 5 New Zealanders are still drinking water that is either not safe or is not being tested to assure people that it's safe. That's exactly the sort of funding that assists small communities to make their water potable and able to be drunk safely. And you do wonder if behind this bill, in some respects, the government has chosen to squeeze back the funding that is available to the small communities and their local authorities, and then gear them up so they can take out loans to pay for some of this. And I say that there's nothing wrong with a support from the taxpayer, especially where the funds are there, to assist those small communities, because many of them will continue, even under this bill, providing those slightly lower interest costs. Many small communities will still not be able to afford to improve their drinking water unless they're given some assistance as was provided and envisaged by the last Labor government. Those funds are still there, but now constrained to $10 million a year. And I'd also note, just in the last few weeks, we've seen the last payment under the sewage subsidy scheme that the last Labor government also introduced. So we're seeing 2 funding schemes disappear. We are seeing this sensible mechanism about lower local government borrowing costs. That is commendable. But the background to it includes the loss of 2 schemes, which I think have assisted many small communities to upgrade their very basic and most essential services. And that is something worth supporting also. In the meantime, this bill proceeds through the House. Labor supports this bill.
Nikki Kay.
Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to speak on